You've seen people walk into a courtroom like they own it, confident, untouchable, protected by power. They believe their bank account is a fortress that the law simply cannot penetrate. This was one of those cases. A man who believed his net worth would save him. But what happened next? No one in that courtroom expected. I've presided over thousands of cases in my decades on the bench. I've seen every shade of human behavior, liars, cheats, the desperate, and the foolish. But every so often, someone walks through those heavy oak doors who is so blinded by their own privilege, they completely forget where they are. Richard Sterling was one of those people. A billionaire venture capitalist and real estate mogul, accustomed to private jets and boardrooms where his word was absolute law. He walked into my courtroom wearing a custom bespoke suit that probably cost more than my bailiff makes in an entire year. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and a platinum watch peeked out from his cuff. But it wasn't the luxury that caught my attention, it was the smirk. The absolute, unadulterated arrogance of a man who believed this entire proceeding was entirely beneath him. The case file on my desk told a sickening story. Sterling wasn't here for a high-stakes corporate dispute. He was here because he decided that a red light in a busy elementary school crosswalk didn't apply to his brand-new, $500,000 sports car. And worse, when confronted by the crossing guard, a 72-year-old, retired Marine named Arthur Jenkins, Sterling didn't just ignore him. According to the police report, he rolled down his window, threw a crumpled $100 bill at the veteran's feet, and told him to buy a new vest and get a real job. As Sterling approached the defendant's podium, he didn't even bother to look at me. He was tapping away on his smartphone, visibly annoyed by the inconvenience of the justice system. The gallery was packed this morning. Everyday, hard-working people waiting for their own cases watched in hushed silence. They recognized the type. The untouchable elite who always seem to walk away without a scratch while the rest of the world plays by the rules. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice cutting sharply through the quiet hum of the room. He didn't look up. Instead, he held up a single, manicured index finger, a gesture telling a sitting judge in open court to wait. The bailiff stiffened, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. The court reporter's hands hovered, entirely frozen over her keys. "I'll be with you in a second, Your Honor," Sterling mumbled, his eyes still glued to his glowing screen. "Just closing a 9-figure acquisition. Actual important business." I let the silence hang for exactly 3 seconds. I wanted everyone in that gallery to witness the sheer, breathtaking audacity of this man. "Put the phone away, sir," I commanded, the temperature in the courtroom dropping to absolute zero, "because the only thing you are acquiring today is a harsh lesson in reality." Sterling slowly lowered his phone, but his expression didn't change. It was still that infuriating, condescending smirk, the kind of look you give a waiter who brought you the wrong vintage of wine. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with forced patience, "I don't think you understand who I am, or what my time is worth. My company generates more tax revenue for this city in a quarter than this entire building consumes in a decade. I'm scheduled to meet with the mayor at noon." The courtroom erupted in low murmurs. An older woman in the second row, clutching a worn handbag, shook her head in disbelief. A young man next to her leaned forward, his eyes wide. Sterling hadn't just insulted me, he had insulted the very concept of the law. He had publicly declared that his wealth made him immune to the rules that governed every single person sitting behind him. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the heavy mahogany of the bench. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. When you speak the truth in a room full of people waiting for justice, a whisper is as loud as a gunshot. "Mr. Sterling," I began, my tone measured, precise, and completely devoid of warmth. "I know exactly who you are. The problem is, you have forgotten where you are. This is a court of law, not a boardroom, not your private club, and certainly not a place where justice is sold to the highest bidder." I opened the file. "Let's look at the facts. You were cited for running a red light in an active school zone at 3:15 p.m. You nearly struck a pedestrian, a crossing guard who was attempting to protect children. Do you deny this?" Sterling sighed, shifting his weight. It was a rolling stop, barely a red light, and the man stepped out too early. "Look, I've already had my assistant cut a check for the fine. Can we just process the paperwork so I can leave?" "A rolling stop," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "The traffic camera footage tells a very different story." I gestured to the bailiff. "Play the video, please." The large screen on the wall flickered to life. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as the footage played. It showed a busy intersection, children with backpacks waiting on the corner, The light turned yellow, then a solid, undeniable red. 2 seconds later, Sterling's silver sports car tore through the frame, not even tapping the brakes. The crossing guard, Arthur Jenkins, was already in the crosswalk, his stop sign raised high. The car missed him by inches. The force of the passing vehicle spun the elderly man around, and he fell hard onto the asphalt. The collective gasp from the gallery was audible. It wasn't a rolling stop. It was reckless, dangerous, and entirely deliberate. Sterling had prioritized his schedule over human life. I turned my gaze back to the defendant. The smirk was finally gone, replaced by a tight, defensive scowl. But he still didn't look remorseful. He looked annoyed that the video was making him look bad. "Inches, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice hardening. "You missed a 7-2-year-old man and potentially the children behind him by a matter of inches." Sterling crossed his arms. I was in complete control of the vehicle. It looks worse on camera than it was. And like I said, I compensated the man for his trouble. "You threw a $100 bill at him," I corrected, my anger finally starting to seep through my professional composure. "You treated a near-fatal collision like a bad tip at a restaurant. You believed you could buy your way out of accountability." Sterling opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, the courtroom doors swung open. A tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair walked in. The murmurs in the gallery spiked again. It was Charles Sterling, Richard's father, the founder of the family empire, and a man whose influence reached into the highest levels of state government. He walked down the center aisle, his presence commanding immediate attention. Richard turned, a look of relief washing over his face. He actually smiled. "Ah," Richard said, turning back to me, the arrogance returning in full force. "It seems my representation has arrived. I think we can wrap this up now, Your Honor." He thought his father had come to save him. He thought the cavalry had arrived. But as Charles Sterling approached the railing, the look on his face wasn't one of support. It was one of profound, devastating disappointment. Charles Sterling did not look at his son. He didn't acknowledge the smirk that was slowly fading from Richard's face. Instead, the older man walked directly toward the bench, stopping just behind the low wooden railing that separated the gallery from the court. He took off his hat, holding it respectfully in front of him. "Your Honor," Charles said, his voice deep and resonant. It was a voice used to commanding boardrooms and silencing dissent, but right now it was laced with a heavy, unmistakable sorrow. "May I have permission to address the court?" I looked at the defense table. Richard's lawyer, a sharp-suited man who had been frantically taking notes, jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Sterling Sr. is not a party to this case. His presence here is highly irregular." "Overruled," I said flatly, keeping my eyes on Charles. "In my courtroom, I decide what is regular. Proceed, Mr. Sterling." Charles nodded slowly. He finally turned to look at his son. Richard had shrunk slightly, the $5,000 suit suddenly looking a size too big for him. The bravado was evaporating, replaced by the instinctual apprehension of a child caught misbehaving. "I built my company from nothing," Charles began, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. "I spent 40 years teaching my children that wealth is a tool to build communities, not a weapon to tear them down. I taught them that power comes with an absolute duty to protect those who have less." He paused, taking a slow breath. He turned his gaze back to me, and I saw genuine pain in his eyes. "Your Honor, I received a call this morning from Arthur Jenkins, the crossing guard." Richard's head snapped up, his eyes widening in sheer panic. "Dad, wait." "Quiet," Charles snapped, the single word cracking like a whip. Richard flinched and fell silent. Charles continued. "Arthur and I served together in the 1st Marine Division in Vietnam. He saved my life during the Tet Offensive. He carried me 2 miles with shrapnel in my leg. We haven't spoken in years, but he recognized my last name on the police report." The gallery collectively inhaled. You could hear a pin drop. The untouchable millionaire hadn't just almost hit a crossing guard. He had almost run down a war hero who had saved his own father's life. The sheer karmic weight of the revelation pressed down on the room. "Arthur told me what happened," Charles said, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. "He told me about the car. He told me about the near miss. But mostly, Your Honor, he told me what my son said to him. He told me about the $100 bill." Charles reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crumpled, dirty $100 bill. He placed it carefully on the wooden railing. "I did not raise my son to believe he could buy a man's dignity," Charles said, his voice breaking, then hardening into steel. I did not build an empire so he could use it as a shield against his own cowardice and arrogance. He turned back to Richard, who was now staring at the floor, his face burning a bright, humiliating red. "Richard," Charles said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "you have disgraced our name. You have disrespected a man who bled for this country, and you have treated this courtroom and this judge as an inconvenience." Charles then did something that no one in that room, not even me, expected. He turned back to the bench, stood tall, and made a request that would change his son's life forever. Charles Sterling kept his eyes locked on mine. The silence in the room was so profound you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. "Your Honor," Charles said, his voice steady, but carrying the heavy burden of a father's ultimate failure. "I am not here to offer legal representation for my son. I am here to formally withdraw the backing of the Sterling Family Trust from this matter. He will not have our corporate attorneys. He will not have our public relations team spinning this into a minor misunderstanding." Richard gripped the wooden edge of the defendant's table so hard his knuckles turned white. "Dad, are you out of your mind? You're going to let them crucify me over a traffic ticket?" "It is not a traffic ticket, Richard," Charles roared, his composure finally breaking. The sudden volume made half the gallery jump. "It is a measure of your character. You nearly killed a man who carried me through the mud in Hugh City while bleeding from his own wounds. And your first instinct was to throw money at him like he was a nuisance." Charles turned back to the bench. "Your Honor, my request is simple. Treat him exactly as you would treat a young man with nothing in his bank account. Do not grant him leniency. Show him the reality he has been shielded from his entire life. If he needs to spend time in a cell to understand the value of human life, then I ask that you send him there." The air was sucked out of the room. A billionaire father had just stood in open court and asked a judge to throw the book at his own son. The gallery was mesmerized. The everyday people who had watched Richard strut in like a king were now watching his empire crumble in real time. Richard was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for an exit, looking for an ally. There were none. The high-priced lawyer standing next to him slowly closed his briefcase, realizing his retainer had just been implicitly revoked by the man who actually signed the checks. "Mr. Sterling Sr.," I said, my voice softening just a fraction out of respect for the agonizing choice this father had just made. "The court recognizes your statement, and I assure you, your son's net worth was never going to be a factor in my courtroom. But your presence here today, it ensures that justice will not only be served, but it will be deeply understood." I picked up my gavel, its wooden handle smooth and familiar in my grip. I looked down at Richard, who was now stripped of his armor, his money, and his father's protection. He was just a man, a reckless, arrogant man facing the full, unyielding weight of the law. "Richard Sterling," I commanded, my voice projecting authority and absolute finality. "Stand up straight and look at me. Your protective bubble has just popped." Richard stood alone at the defense table. The high-powered corporate attorney who had been whispering confidently in his ear just minutes ago took a step back, slowly clicking his leather briefcase shut. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, his voice entirely devoid of its previous swagger, "in light of Mr. Sterling Sr.'s statement and the formal withdrawal of the family trust's backing, I must request permission to withdraw as counsel for the defendant." I nodded slowly, my eyes never leaving Richard's pale face. "Request granted. You are excused, counselor." The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom clicked shut behind the lawyer, leaving Richard Sterling completely isolated. The invisible shield of wealth that had protected him since birth had just evaporated into thin air. I watched the terrifying realization hit him. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead. The gallery, sensing the absolute shift in power, leaned forward collectively. They were watching an untouchable predator suddenly realize he had become the prey. "Your Honor, please, listen to me," Richard stammered, his voice rising an octave. The smooth, baritone arrogance was entirely gone. "I can explain. It was a momentary lapse in judgment. The markets were incredibly volatile yesterday. I was under immense pressure. I'll make it right. I'll write a check right now to Mr. Jenkins for $50,000. $100,000. I'll donate a new crosswalk system to the school. Just tell me the amount." I struck my gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack made Richard jump viscerally. "You still don't get it, do you?" I said, my voice echoing with pure, concentrated authority. "You are standing in the wreckage of your own character, and your very first instinct is to pull out your checkbook. You cannot buy a clean conscience in my courtroom, Mr. Sterling. You cannot purchase a waiver for human decency." I opened the thick folder in front of me, adjusting my glasses. Let us look at your driving history. 4 speeding tickets in the last 2 years, 3 red light camera violations, 2 citations for illegal parking in handicapped zones, all paid immediately. Let me guess you never even saw these citations, did you? Your assistant simply paid them. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. My staff handles my minor administrative tasks. Yes. They are not administrative tasks, I thundered, letting my voice fill every corner of the room. They are legal warnings, warnings that you are endangering the public. But because the fines are equivalent to what you spend on a Tuesday lunch, you treated the law like a premium subscription service. You paid a premium fee to do whatever you wanted. I looked over at Charles Sterling. The older man stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on his son with a heartbreaking mixture of grief and resolve. Mr. Sterling, I said, turning my piercing gaze back to the trembling billionaire at the podium. Your father has asked me to introduce you to the reality of the world you live in, and that is exactly what I am going to do. Because in my courtroom, we are officially done talking about money. Charles Sterling turned slowly, fixing his gaze on his son. The disappointment in his eyes was heavier than any sentence I could ever hand down. Richard, completely unmoored, simply stared back, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. You have 30 days, Richard, Charles said, his voice quiet but echoing with undeniable finality. 30 days to move your personal belongings out of the corporate penthouse. The keys to the jet, the company credit cards, your seat on the executive board, they are all revoked, effective immediately. If you want to rebuild your life, you will do it with your own 2 hands, on your own merit. He turned back to the bench, nodded respectfully to me, and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him with a resonant thud, severing the final tether connecting Richard Sterling to his former reality. I looked down at the young man. He was trembling. The bespoke suit now looked absurd, a costume worn by an actor who had completely forgotten his lines. Mr. Sterling, I began, my tone measured, slicing through the stunned silence of the gallery. The original fine for this violation, taking into account the school zone, is $1,000. Richard swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. Yes, Your Honor, I'll pay it immediately. I wasn't finished, I snapped, halting him mid-sentence. Given the aggravating circumstances, the reckless speed, the near collision with a pedestrian, the profound disrespect for this court, and the clear indication that a financial penalty is entirely meaningless to you, I am holding you in contempt of court. That will be an additional $5,000 fine. But more importantly, I continued, leaning forward, your driver's license is hereby suspended for a period of exactly 1 year. And, as part of your sentence, you will complete 200 hours of mandatory community service. Richard's face drained of its remaining color. Community service? Your Honor, my schedule. How am I supposed to? You have plenty of time now, Mr. Sterling, I reminded him coldly. You will be serving those 200 hours working at the very intersection where this incident occurred. You will wear a reflective vest, you will hold a stop sign, and you will ensure that every single child crosses that street safely. The gallery erupted in spontaneous applause. It wasn't the polite clapping of an audience. It was the visceral, cathartic release of people witnessing a genuine moment of justice. I didn't reach for my gavel to quiet them. I let Richard Sterling hear exactly what the real world thought of him. When the room finally settled, I offered my final words. Mr. Sterling, you walked in here believing you were untouchable. You are leaving here with a suspended license, a suspended life, and a vest to wear in the rain. Let this be the defining lesson of your life. Character is what remains when power fails. And today, your power failed completely. I struck the gavel. Court is adjourned. As Richard Sterling stood there, completely stripped of his armor, the reality of his situation began to sink in. The murmurs in the gallery had died down, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. They were waiting to see if the billionaire would actually accept the consequences or if he would find some final, desperate loophole. Richard looked at me, then down at his empty hands. The keys to the sports car were gone. The corporate credit cards were essentially useless plastic. The penthouse was no longer his home. For the first time in his 32 years of life, he had absolutely nothing to fall back on except his own actions. Community service, he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. 200 hours. That is correct, I said, my voice unwavering. And you will begin tomorrow morning at 7:30 a.m. You will report to the crossing guard supervisor for your safety vest and your stop sign. If you are 1 minute late, or if you fail to complete your shift, I will sign a warrant for your arrest. Do I make myself perfectly clear? Yes, Your Honor, he whispered. It was the first time he had spoken without a trace of condescension. Good. Now, regarding the financial restitution, I continued. You mentioned earlier that you were willing to write a check to Mr. Jenkins. I believe you offered $50,000? $100,000? Richard nodded eagerly, a glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. Yes, whatever it takes to make this right. I am ordering you to pay Mr. Jenkins the sum of $50,000, I stated. However, there is a condition. Richard frowned, confused. A condition? Yes. The money must not come from the Sterling Family Trust or any corporate account. It must come directly from your personal liquid assets. And furthermore, you will deliver the check to him personally, in hand, before you begin your community service tomorrow. I paused, letting the weight of the order settle over him. You tried to buy his dignity with a crumpled $100 bill, Mr. Sterling. You will now attempt to restore it with $50,000 of your own dollars, and an apology that had better be the most sincere words you have ever spoken in your life. Richard looked as though he had been physically struck. The financial hit was substantial, even for him, but the public humiliation of having to personally apologize to the man he had so casually dismissed was the real punishment. I understand, Your Honor, he finally managed to say. I looked past him to the back of the courtroom where a lone figure stood, leaning against the heavy oak doors. It was Arthur Jenkins, the crossing guard. He had arrived late, quietly slipping into the back row to witness the conclusion of the case. He stood straight and tall, a quiet dignity radiating from him despite his faded jacket and simple trousers. Mr. Jenkins, I called out. Arthur took a step forward, his eyes steady. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Sterling has something to say to you, I said, turning my gaze back to Richard, and he will say it now, in open court. Richard turned, following my gaze. He saw the elderly man standing there, the man he had nearly run over, the man he had insulted, the man who had once saved his own father's life. The courtroom held its breath as the billionaire faced the veteran. For a long moment, Richard didn't say anything. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, slowly, painfully, Richard Sterling began to speak. Richard Sterling took a shaky breath, looking at the man in the faded jacket. The immense power differential that usually defined his interactions was completely gone. In this room, Arthur Jenkins held all the moral authority, and Richard had nothing but his own shame. Mr. Jenkins, Richard began, his voice surprisingly small. He cleared his throat and tried again, speaking slightly louder but with none of his usual bravado. Arthur, I am deeply sorry for my actions yesterday. I was reckless. I was driving too fast, and I wasn't paying attention to the crosswalk. Arthur Jenkins didn't blink. He just watched the young billionaire with calm, steady eyes. Richard swallowed hard, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. But worse than the driving was what I said to you afterward. I was arrogant. I was incredibly disrespectful to a man who was just doing his job, protecting children, and to a man who served our country. He paused, a look of genuine regret finally crossing his face. The reality of his father's story had clearly struck a nerve. I threw money at you because I thought money could fix my mistakes. I was wrong. It was an insult to your dignity, and I am profoundly sorry. The silence in the courtroom felt completely different now. It was no longer the shocked silence of outrage. It was the quiet respect of witnessing a necessary, painful, humbling. Arthur Jenkins nodded slowly, his expression softening just a fraction. I accept your apology, Mr. Sterling, but I hope you understand that yesterday wasn't about me. It was about the kids behind me. If you had hit one of them, no amount of money or apologies would have ever fixed it. I understand, Richard whispered. I truly do. Then I expect to see you at 7:30 tomorrow morning, Arthur said simply. Bring a thermos. It gets cold on that corner. I watched the exchange from the bench, feeling a quiet satisfaction. This is what the justice system is supposed to do. It isn't just about punishment. It's about correction. It's about taking someone who believes they are above society and forcing them to re-enter it as an equal. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, I said, breaking the silence. I looked back down at the defense table. Mr. Sterling, you have your orders. The fine, the personal check, the suspended license, and 200 hours of community service under Mr. Jenkins' supervision. You will report to this court in exactly 30 days with proof of compliance. I picked up the heavy wooden gavel one last time. Let today be a reminder to everyone in this room and especially to you, Mr. Sterling. Wealth can buy many things in this world. It can buy comfort, it can buy access, and it can buy influence. But it cannot buy a free pass from accountability. And it certainly cannot buy character. I brought the gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack. This court is adjourned. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as I stepped down from the bench. As I walked back to my chambers, I glanced back at the courtroom one last time. Richard Sterling was standing alone, looking lost, but, perhaps for the first time in his life, grounded in reality. The untouchable mogul had been broken, not by malice, but by the absolute, unwavering weight of the truth.